A homeless man saves a lost child during a freezing winter storm. The next day, he is shocked to find out that the child is the mayor's son. Tom Wilson pulled his thin coat tighter around his shoulders as he walked through the bustling streets of the city. The wind bit at his face, and he could feel the chill seeping through the holes in his worn-out shoes. Winter had come early this year, and Tom knew from experience that the nights would only get colder. He looked around at the sea of people, everyone wrapped in thick jackets and scarves, hurrying to get home. None of them noticed him. They never did. He glanced up at the digital billboard on the side of a building, displaying the weather forecast. A storm was coming, and it was going to be a bad one. The newscaster's voice blared from a nearby TV screen in a shop window, warning everyone to stay indoors and off the roads. Tom sighed. Staying indoors wasn't an option for him. He'd have to find shelter somewhere safe before the storm hit. Tom made his way to the park, where a small group of homeless people had gathered around a makeshift fire. He recognized a few faces and nodded in their direction. "Tom!" one of the men called out. It was Jerry, an old friend who'd been living on the streets even longer than Tom. "You hear about the storm?" "Yeah, I heard," Tom said, crouching down by the fire to warm his hands. "Figured I'd head to the gazebo. It's usually empty when the weather's bad." "What about you?" Jerry shrugged. "Might try the shelter downtown, but they fill up quick." "You know how it is." Tom nodded. He did know. The shelters were often full, and even when they weren't, Tom preferred to be on his own. He liked the quiet, the solitude. "Stay safe, Jerry," he said, getting to his feet. "I'll see you around." Tom left the group and headed deeper into the park. The trees were bare, their branches silhouetted against the gray sky. He quickened his pace, making his way to the small gazebo near the center of the park. It was tucked away, out of sight, and offered some protection from the elements. He'd spent many nights there, reading one of the books he'd picked up from the free library down the street. As he approached the gazebo, Tom noticed something unusual. A small figure huddled on the steps, barely visible in the growing darkness. Tom hesitated, then moved closer. It was a boy, no more than 10 years old, shivering in a thin jacket, his face pale and frightened. Tom's heart sank. What was a kid doing out here alone, especially with a storm coming? "Hey," Tom said softly, crouching down beside the boy. "You okay?" The boy flinched and looked up at Tom with wide eyes. He didn't say anything, just pulled his knees tighter to his chest. Tom held up his hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Tom." "What's yours?" "David," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "David, huh?" Tom said, smiling a little. "That's a good name. You lost?" David nodded, his eyes filling with tears. Tom's smile faded. "Where's your family? Your parents?" I don't know," David said, his voice trembling. "I got lost. I was just walking and then I don't know where I am." Tom glanced around, his mind racing. They didn't have much time before the storm hit, and there was no way he was leaving this kid out here alone. "Okay, listen. There's a storm coming, and we need to get you somewhere safe. You see that gazebo over there?" Tom pointed to the small structure just a few feet away. "It'll keep us dry for now. Come on, I'll stay with you until we figure out what to do." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Tom helped him to his feet, and they hurried over to the gazebo. Tom took off his coat and wrapped it around David's shoulders, ignoring the cold that immediately hit his own skin. David looked up at him, surprised. "But you'll be cold," he said. Tom shrugged. "I'll be fine. You need it more than I do." He sat down beside David, keeping an eye on the park's entrance. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to leave David alone. As the first real gusts of the storm began to howl through the park, Tom glanced at David, who was already looking a little less scared. Despite his own discomfort, he kept his eyes on David, who was curled up beside him, trying to make himself as small as possible. Tom's old coat hung loosely on the boy's small frame, and every so often, David's teeth would chatter. "You hanging in there?" Tom asked softly. David nodded, but his face was pale, and Tom could see him shivering. Tom wished he had more to give the boy. A blanket, something warm to drink. He thought about the small fire back where Jerry and the others were, but the walk back there would leave them both soaked through. No, it was better to stay here and figure out what to do when morning came. They sat in silence for a while, the storm raging outside their little shelter. Tom could tell David was still scared, his eyes darting to the shadows around them, his body tense. Tom decided it was time to break the silence. "So, David," he said, keeping his voice light, "how'd you end up out here all by yourself?" David looked down at his feet, avoiding Tom's gaze. "I don't know," he mumbled. I wanted to go for a walk. I like walking, but then I couldn't find my way back." Tom nodded, trying to keep his tone gentle. "Where were you trying to get back to?" "My house," David said quietly. It's really big. I have my own room and everything. But, he trailed off, looking lost for words. But you didn't want to go back there, Tom guessed. David nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Tom understood that look. The look of someone feeling trapped, wanting to escape even if they didn't know where to go. It's okay, Tom said after a moment. Sometimes it's nice to just be out on your own, right? Get some space, some fresh air. David looked up at him then, his eyes wide and a little less afraid. Yeah, he said. That's what I wanted. Just some space. Tom smiled a little. I get it, but next time maybe try to remember where you're going, okay? This city's a big place. Easy to get lost in, especially for someone your age. David nodded. I know, I wasn't thinking. He looked down again, his voice dropping to a whisper. My dad's gonna be so mad. Tom felt a pang of sympathy. Your dad, huh? What's he like? David hesitated, then shrugged. He's the mayor. Robert Caldwell. You've probably heard of him. Tom blinked, caught off guard. The mayor's son. That explained the boy's clean clothes, the look of someone not used to being outside for long. Tom had seen Mayor Caldwell's face on posters all over the city, always talking about safety, security, and prosperity. Tom had never thought much of politicians, but he knew the mayor was popular. His son, lost and alone in the park. Tom could only imagine the chaos this would cause. Tom kept his voice calm. Yeah, I've heard of him. So, you're David Caldwell, huh? That's a pretty big name to carry around. David made a face. I hate it. Everyone always treats me different because of who my dad is. I just want to be normal, you know? Tom nodded. Yeah, I get that. It's hard when everyone expects you to be something you're not. He thought about his own life, how different things had been before everything fell apart. But you know, just because people have expectations doesn't mean you have to meet all of them. Sometimes it's okay to just be yourself. David looked at him surprised. You think so? Tom smiled. I know so. You're a good kid, David. I can tell. You don't have to be anyone but yourself. For a moment, the storm seemed to fade into the background, the rain's noise replaced by the sound of David's steady breathing as he relaxed a little. Tom was glad to see it, glad to know he could help the boy feel safer. They still had the night ahead of them, and Tom knew they'd have to figure out what to do come morning. But for now, at least, David wasn't so scared. Tell me more about your dad, Tom said, hoping to keep the conversation going, to keep David's mind off the cold and the storm. What's he like when he's not being the mayor? David's face softened. He's really busy most of the time, always in meetings or on the phone. But he tries, you know? He wants to do good things for the city. Sometimes he doesn't have time for me. I think he forgets I'm still a kid. Tom nodded. It's hard being busy, hard to find the right balance, I guess. He leaned back against the gazebo's railing, thinking about his own father, about how much time they used to spend together before life took its turns. You ever tell him how you feel? David shook his head. He wouldn't understand. He's always talking about responsibility and doing the right thing. I didn't want to disappoint him. Tom reached out and gently patted David's shoulder. You're not disappointing anyone, David. You're just being honest, and sometimes being honest is the bravest thing you can do. David's eyes were heavy with sleep now, his body slumping against Tom's side. Tom wrapped his arm around the boy, holding him close for warmth, and felt a strange sense of peace. For tonight, at least, they were safe. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but they'd face them when they came. As David drifted off, Tom kept watch, the darkness of the park closing in around them. The storm might rage on, but here in the gazebo, under its shelter, Tom felt a small flicker of hope. Beside him, David slept fitfully, his head resting against Tom's shoulder, wrapped in the too large coat. Every so often, the boy would shiver, and Tom would pull him closer, trying to shield him from the cold. Tom's thoughts wandered as he stared out into the darkness. He couldn't stop thinking about David's father, Mayor Caldwell. What would a man like that say if he knew his son was out here in the park, huddled next to a homeless stranger? Tom knew he had to get David back to his family, but he couldn't help feeling a little reluctant. The park, the gazebo, this was his world, a world people like the mayor never saw. Tom didn't want David to forget what he'd seen tonight, to understand that there were different sides to this city, sides that were often ignored. David stirred beside him, mumbling something in his sleep. Tom patted the boy's shoulder gently. It's okay, he whispered. You're safe. David blinked awake, his eyes cloudy with sleep. Tom, he asked, his voice small and uncertain, is the storm over? Tom shook his head. Not yet, but it'll pass soon. You were having a dream. Sounded like you were talking to someone. David rubbed his eyes. I dreamed I was back home, he said softly. My dad was there. He was looking for me. Tom nodded. He's probably worried about you, David. When the storm clears, we'll figure out how to get you back to him. David fell silent for a moment, then asked, Why are you out here, Tom? Why don't you have a home? Tom considered the question, not sure how to answer. He didn't want to scare David, but he also didn't want to lie. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan, Tom said slowly. I used to have a place to live, everything. But things changed. I lost my job and then my home. I tried to get back on my feet, but it's hard. The city can be tough on people who don't have much. David looked up at him, his eyes filled with curiosity. But you're smart and you're nice. Why doesn't someone help you? Tom smiled a little at that. It's not always about being smart or nice, David. Sometimes it's just about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. People get busy with their own lives. They don't always see what's happening around them. Or maybe they don't know how to help. David thought about this for a while, then said, if I was the mayor, I'd make sure everyone had a home. I wouldn't let anyone be alone. Tom felt a warmth in his chest at David's words. That's a good way to think, David. Maybe one day you'll grow up and do just that. They sat together in silence for a while, listening to the rain. Tom's mind kept turning over their conversation, the simple honesty in David's words. It reminded him of something he'd forgotten over the years, a sense of hope, the belief that things could change. He'd buried those feelings deep, hidden them away to survive each day. Do you ever wish things were different? David asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Tom glanced at him, surprised by the question. Of course, he said, everyone does. But wishing doesn't always make things happen. Sometimes you just have to make the best of what you've got. David nodded. I guess. But it's still okay to wish, right? Tom smiled. Yeah, David, it's okay to wish. The storm finally began to ease. The first light of dawn crept through the clouds, casting a gray glow over the park. Tom looked out from the gazebo, seeing the park's paths glistening wet. It was quiet now, the city still waking up. We should go, Tom said softly. See if we can find someone to help get you home. David looked hesitant. What if they don't believe you? What if they think you did something bad? Tom's heart ached at the fear in the boy's voice. I won't let anything happen to you, David. I promise. I know someone who can help. Samantha. She's a social worker, and she's good at listening. She won't judge. We'll go to her. David still seemed unsure, but he nodded. Okay, if you think she'll help. Tom stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. He held out a hand to David, helping him to his feet. Together, they stepped out of the gazebo, the cold morning air biting at them. Tom pulled his coat tighter around David, shielding him as best he could. They walked through the park, their footsteps echoing on the empty paths. The city was quiet, the buildings looming over them like silent sentinels. Tom kept his eyes peeled for any sign of trouble, any indication that someone might mistake them for something they weren't. But the streets were empty, the storm having driven everyone indoors. Tom led David to a small community center at the edge of the park, where Samantha often worked. The building was plain, with a simple sign and a worn door. Tom knocked, feeling a knot of worry in his stomach. What if she wasn't there? What if she couldn't help? The door opened, and Samantha's familiar face appeared, looking surprised to see them. Tom? What are you doing here? She asked, her eyes quickly taking in the scene. Tom's soaked clothes, the shivering boy beside him. Sam, this is David, Tom said quickly. He got lost in the park last night. He needs to get home. Samantha's eyes softened as she looked at David. Come inside, both of you, she said, stepping aside to let them in. Let's get you warmed up, and then we'll figure this out. Tom led David into the warm interior of the community center, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. They were safe now, out of the storm, and with Samantha's help, he was sure they could find a way to get David back to his family. As they settled in, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change, not just for David, but for himself as well. The warmth of the community center wrapped around Tom and David like a comforting blanket, a stark contrast to the bitter cold of the night. Samantha guided them to a small room with a few chairs and a table. She quickly disappeared and returned with 2 steaming mugs of cocoa, placing one in front of David and the other in front of Tom. Drink up, Samantha said gently, her eyes focused on David. You must be freezing. David hesitated for a moment, then wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers. He took a small sip, his eyes closing as the warmth spread through him. Tom watched, feeling a wave of gratitude for Samantha. She always knew what to do, how to make people feel safe. Thank you, David whispered, looking up at her. Samantha smiled. You're welcome, David. Can you tell me what happened? David glanced at Tom, then back at Samantha. I got lost, he said quietly. I was just walking, and then I couldn't find my way back. Tom spoke up, wanting to fill in the gaps. I found him in the park last night, just before the storm hit. He was scared and cold. I couldn't leave him out there, Sam. We waited out the storm in the gazebo, and when morning came, I brought him here. Samantha nodded, her expression serious but kind. You did the right thing, Tom. We'll get David home safe, I promise. She turned back to David. Do you know where you live, David? Can you tell me your address? David shook his head. No, but my dad's the mayor, Robert Caldwell. You can call him. Tom noticed the slight change in Samantha's expression, the surprise, the quick calculation. The mayor's son? She asked, looking at Tom for confirmation. Tom nodded. Yeah, I didn't know at first, but David told me last night. That's why I came to you. I didn't want to just walk into a police station with him. I figured it'd be better if you handled it. Samantha sighed, understanding the unspoken concern. You did the right thing, Tom. Let me make a call. Stay here, both of you. I'll be right back. As Samantha left the room, Tom and David sat in silence for a moment. Tom could see the worry in David's eyes, the fear of what might happen next. He leaned forward, trying to catch the boy's gaze. Hey, it's gonna be okay, Tom said softly. Samantha's good at this. She'll make sure everything goes smoothly. David nodded, but his hand still trembled around the mug. What if my dad's mad at me? What if he thinks I did something wrong? Tom shook his head. You didn't do anything wrong, David. You just got lost. Your dad's probably worried sick about you. When he sees you, he'll just be happy you're safe. David looked at Tom, searching his face for reassurance. Will you stay with me when he comes? Tom hesitated. He wasn't sure how Mayor Caldwell would react to seeing his son with a homeless man, but he couldn't bring himself to leave David alone. Not after everything they'd been through. I'll stay, Tom promised. I won't leave until you're back with your family. A small smile appeared on David's face, a flicker of relief. Thanks, Tom. You're really nice. I'm glad you found me. Tom felt a lump in his throat at the boy's words. I'm glad I found you too, David, he said quietly. You're a good kid. Don't ever forget that. A few minutes later, Samantha returned, her expression a mix of concern and relief. I talked to the mayor's office, she said, addressing them both. They've been looking everywhere for you, David. Your dad's on his way here now. He's bringing some of his security team, so don't be surprised if there are a few extra people around. David's eyes widened. He's really coming? Samantha nodded. Yes, he is, and he sounded very relieved to know you're safe. She looked at Tom. I think it's best if you stay in here with David until the mayor arrives. It might be a little overwhelming. Tom understood what she meant. The presence of security, the media attention, it could all spiral out of control. All right, he agreed. We'll stay put. They waited in the small room, the tension building with each passing minute. Tom could feel David's anxiety growing, his fingers tapping nervously on the mug. Tom reached out and placed a hand on David's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. Remember, everything's going to be fine, he said. Your dad's just happy you're okay. Finally, there was a commotion outside the room. Voices, the sound of footsteps approaching quickly. The door swung open and a tall man in a suit rushed in, his face a mixture of worry and relief. Behind him were two security guards standing watchful at the door. David, the man exclaimed, crossing the room in 2 strides. He knelt down and pulled David into a tight hug, his eyes closing as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Thank God you're safe. I've been worried sick. David hugged his father back, his small arms wrapped around the mayor's neck. I'm sorry, Dad, he mumbled. I didn't mean to get lost. I just wanted to go for a walk. Mayor Caldwell pulled back, his hands on David's shoulders. You scared me half to death, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But you're okay. That's all that matters. He looked up then, noticing Tom for the first time. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in Tom's worn clothes, his tired face. Tom met his gaze steadily, not sure what to expect. Who are you? The mayor asked, his tone cautious. Tom stood up, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. My name's Tom Wilson, he said. I found David in the park last night. He was lost and the storm was coming. I stayed with him to keep him safe, then brought him here this morning. The mayor's eyes softened as he processed Tom's words. He stood up, extending a hand. Thank you, he said sincerely. Thank you for looking after my son. I don't know what we would have done if anything had happened to him. Tom shook the mayor's hand, feeling a strange sense of relief. He's a good kid, Tom said simply. I'm glad I could help. Mayor Caldwell turned to Samantha. I'll make sure Tom is properly thanked, he said. And I want to know more about the homeless situation here. If there are people like Tom willing to help others, then we need to be doing more for them. And Samantha nodded. We can arrange that, Mayor Caldwell. Tom's been through a lot, but he's one of the good ones. This city could use more people like him. The mayor looked back at Tom, a thoughtful expression on his face. Maybe there's more we can do, he said quietly, for all of us. Tom stood there, feeling the weight of the mayor's words. He hadn't expected gratitude, hadn't expected anything at all. But now, standing in the warmth of the community center, with David by his side, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As the mayor and David prepared to leave, David turned back to Tom. Will I see you again? He asked, his eyes full of uncertainty. Tom smiled. You know where to find me, he said, and I'll always be around if you need me. David nodded, his smile returning. Bye, Tom. Bye, David, Tom said softly, watching as the boy walked out with his father, surrounded by security. As the door closed behind them, Tom took a deep breath, feeling the world shift around him. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like things were going to be okay. Tom stood by the window of the small community center, looking out at the rain-soaked park. The sky was still overcast, but the storm had passed, leaving behind a wet, quiet city. Tom could see the mayor's car parked near the entrance, flanked by 2 black SUVs. A small group of people had gathered, whispering and pointing. News must have spread quickly. Tom knew how fast word traveled in this city, especially when it involved the mayor. Behind him, Samantha was on the phone, her voice calm and professional. Yes, he's fine, she was saying. The mayor just picked him up. Yes, the boy was found by a homeless man, Tom Wilson. He's been taking care of him. Yes, he's still here at the center. I'm sure he'll want to talk to you. Okay, thank you. She hung up and turned to Tom, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. That was one of the mayor's aides, she said. They're planning a press conference. They want to thank you publicly for what you did. Tom felt a wave of anxiety at the thought. A press conference? I didn't do this for attention, Sam. I just wanted to help the boy. Samantha nodded. I know, Tom, but sometimes good deeds don't go unnoticed. People need to hear stories like this. It reminds them that there's still kindness out there. Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, Sam. I'm not used to all this attention. What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm just trying to get something out of it? Samantha stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. You've got nothing to worry about, Tom. You did the right thing. That's all that matters. And if the mayor wants to thank you, let him. Maybe it'll open some doors for you, help you get back on your feet. Tom looked at her, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes. Samantha had always been kind to him, always looking out for him, even when he resisted help. You really think this could change things? He asked quietly. Samantha smiled. I think it already has. Before Tom could respond, there was a commotion at the front of the center. The door opened, and Mayor Caldwell walked in, flanked by 2 security guards. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on Tom. Mr. Wilson, he said, striding forward, I wanted to speak with you personally before things get too chaotic. Tom nodded, unsure of what to say. He noticed that David was not with the mayor and wondered where he'd gone. The mayor must have sensed his thoughts because he quickly added, David is with his mother. She's been worried sick. I promised I'd bring him home as soon as possible. Tom nodded, feeling a pang of relief. I'm glad he's safe, he said. He's a good kid. Mayor Caldwell's expression softened. Yes, he is. And I'm grateful to you for taking care of him. You have no idea how much it means to me and my wife. I want to make sure you are recognized for your actions. Tom shifted uncomfortably. You don't have to do that. I was just doing what anyone would do. The mayor shook his head. Not everyone would have done what you did, Tom. You showed kindness and compassion when you didn't have to. That's something worth acknowledging. I've already spoken with some of my contacts in the city. We're going to make sure you have a place to stay, and I'm personally going to help you find a job. It's the least I can do. Tom stared at him, surprised. You'd do that for me? Why? The mayor smiled. Because you reminded me that everyone has value, no matter their circumstances. We all need help sometimes, and you've shown more character and integrity than many people I know. It's time the city recognized that. Tom felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't used to people offering him anything without strings attached. He'd learned to survive on his own, to rely on himself. But standing here with the mayor's sincere gratitude and Samantha's encouragement, he felt a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. Thank you, Tom said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. The mayor patted his shoulder. Just keep being the man you are, Tom. That's all anyone can ask. A noise at the door caught their attention, and they turned to see a group of reporters pushing their way in, cameras flashing. The mayor sighed, giving Tom an apologetic look. Looks like the press conference is starting sooner than I thought. You okay with this? Tom hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I'll be okay. They moved to the front of the room where a small podium had been set up. The reporters crowded around, their voices blending into a chaotic hum. Mayor Caldwell held up his hands, calling for silence. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to him. Thank you for coming on such short notice, the mayor began. I want to address the events of the past night and express my deepest gratitude to the man standing beside me, Tom Wilson. Tom shifted uncomfortably as all the cameras turned on him. He could feel the heat of the lights, the weight of everyone's gaze. He kept his eyes on the floor, not wanting to see the judgment he feared would be there. Last night, during the storm, my son David became lost in the park, the mayor continued. Tom found him, cold and frightened, and took him under his wing. He stayed with David through the night, keeping him safe, and brought him to the community center this morning. Thanks to Tom's actions, my son is home safe. For that, my family and I will always be grateful. There was a murmur of approval from the crowd. Tom risked a glance up, expecting skepticism or distrust. Instead, he saw understanding and respect in the eyes of the reporters. It was a strange feeling, being seen as something other than a homeless man, a burden on society. Tom's actions are a reminder that kindness and compassion are still alive in our city, the mayor said. We often talk about improving our community, but it's people like Tom who show us what that really means. I've spoken with several organizations, and we are committed to helping Tom and others like him find the support they need. Together, we can make a difference. The reporters began shouting questions, but the mayor held up his hand. There will be time for questions later, he said. For now, I just want to say thank you to Tom and to everyone who has reached out to offer their support. This is just the beginning of what we can achieve together. The room erupted in applause. Tom stood there, feeling overwhelmed, unsure how to respond. Samantha stepped forward, giving him a reassuring smile. You did good, Tom, she whispered. Really good. Tom nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He had never expected this kind of recognition, never expected his life to change so drastically in such a short time. But standing here, hearing the applause, seeing the gratitude on the mayor's face, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. As the mayor wrapped up his speech, Tom glanced out the window at the park, still wet from the storm. He thought about the night before, about the boy he'd found and the choices he'd made. He had done what he could to help, never expecting anything in return. And now, because of that simple act of kindness, his life was taking a new direction. Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world lift just a little. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he was ready to find out. The days following the press conference were a blur for Tom. Everywhere he went, people seemed to recognize him. It was as if his face had been plastered on every television screen, newspaper, and social media feed in the city. Tom had never been the center of attention before, and the sudden recognition made him uncomfortable. But at the same time, it brought something else, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in a long time. Tom spent his nights at the community center. Samantha had arranged for him to have a cot in one of the small rooms, along with a hot meal every evening. It wasn't much, but to Tom it felt like luxury. He no longer had to worry about finding a safe place to sleep or scavenging for his next meal. The constant fear and uncertainty that had been his companions for years began to fade. One morning, as Tom sipped coffee in the community center's small kitchen, Samantha walked in carrying a large envelope. Good morning, Tom, she said cheerfully. I've got some good news for you. Tom looked up, curious. What's that? Samantha smiled and handed him the envelope. This came for you today. It's from the mayor's office. They found a place for you to stay, a real apartment, and there's a job offer too. You'll be working at the community outreach program, helping other people like yourself get back on their feet. Tom stared at the envelope, hardly daring to believe it. An apartment? And a job? He asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Yes, Samantha said. It's all part of the new initiative the mayor announced. He wants to help people get off the streets, and he's using your story as a starting point. You'll be working as a community liaison, helping to connect people with the resources they need. It's exactly the kind of work you've always been good at, Tom. Tom opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were the keys to a small apartment and a letter from the mayor, outlining the details of his new job. Tom read through it, his eyes widening with each line. It was real. It was really happening. I don't know what to say, Tom said finally, looking up at Samantha. I never thought I'd have a chance like this again. Samantha sat down across from him. You earned this, Tom. You've always helped others, even when you had nothing yourself. Now it's your turn to get the help you deserve. The city needs more people like you, people who understand what it's like to be on the streets and who can make a real difference. Tom nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. I'll do my best, he said quietly. I won't let anyone down. Samantha smiled. I know you won't. The news spread quickly through the community. People who had once passed Tom by without a second glance now stopped to talk to him, to shake his hand, to offer their congratulations. A local business owner approached Tom one afternoon, offering him a job at his cafe if he ever wanted it. It's the least I can do, the senator said. You're an inspiration to all of us, Tom. Tom thanked him, feeling both humbled and overwhelmed. He was used to being invisible, to moving through life unnoticed. Now he was being treated like a hero. It was a strange feeling, but not unwelcome. One afternoon, as Tom was leaving the community center, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was David, his eyes bright with excitement. "Tom," he called, running over. "I've been looking for you." Tom grinned, bending down to meet David's eyes. "Hey, David, what are you doing here?" David shrugged. "My dad told me about your new job and your apartment. He said, I wanted to come see you to make sure you're doing okay." Tom's heart warmed at the boy's concern. "I'm doing great, thanks to you. You're the reason all of this happened, you know." David looked confused. "Me? But you're the one who helped me." Tom nodded. "Yeah, but if I hadn't met you, none of this would have happened. You showed me that it's okay to ask for help, to let people see you for who you really are. You reminded me that there's still good in the world." David smiled. "I'm glad I met you, Tom. You're the best friend I've ever had." Tom felt tears sting in his eyes. He reached out and ruffled David's hair. "You're a pretty good friend too, kid." They spent the afternoon together, talking and laughing, with David sharing stories about school and his family. Tom listened, enjoying the boy's company, feeling a sense of normalcy that had been absent from his life for so long. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen to help David in the first place. It wasn't about recognition or rewards. It was about doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do. As the sun began to set, Tom walked David to the edge of the park, where a car was waiting to take him home. David turned to Tom before getting in. "Will you come visit me sometime?" he asked. "I want to show you my house and introduce you to my mom." Tom nodded. "I'd like that, David. I'd like that a lot." David smiled and waved as the car pulled away, leaving Tom standing on the sidewalk, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, a feeling of contentment he hadn't known in years. His life was changing, and for the first time, he was excited about what the future held. Tom walked back to the community center, his steps light and purposeful. He had a job to prepare for, an apartment to move into, and a new life to build. As he passed by the park, he glanced at the gazebo where he had found David that stormy night. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "Thank you," Tom whispered, as if the park itself could hear him. He knew it wasn't just luck that had brought David into his life. It was something more, something that had been guiding him all along, pushing him toward a second chance. With a deep breath, Tom turned away from the park and headed toward his future. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Tom stood in the doorway of his new apartment, taking it all in. The space was small but clean, with a living area, a kitchenette, and a bedroom tucked away in the corner. A modest bed sat under a window that overlooked the street below, and there was even a small table with 2 chairs next to the kitchen counter. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Tom set his bag down on the bed, feeling a sense of disbelief. It had been years since he'd had a place to call his own. He walked over to the window and looked out at the bustling street below, watching as people hurried along the sidewalks, cars honking in the traffic. He was part of this world again, not just an observer from the shadows. He had a home, a bohème, and a chance to make a difference. A knock at the door pulled Tom from his thoughts. He crossed the room and opened it to find Samantha standing there, a smile on her face. She held up a plastic bag filled with groceries. "Thought you might need a few essentials," she said, stepping inside. Tom took the bag from her, glancing inside. Bread, eggs, milk, some fruit. Simple things, but they meant the world to him. "Thanks, Sam," he said quietly. "You've done so much for me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Samantha waved a hand dismissively. "You don't need to repay me, Tom. You deserve this. I'm just glad to see you settling in. How's the place?" Tom looked around the apartment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's perfect," he said. "I still can't believe it's real. It feels like a dream." "It's real," Samantha assured him, "and this is just the beginning. Your new job starts tomorrow. How are you feeling about that?" Tom felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach, but pushed them aside. "I'm ready," he said. "I want to help. I want to give back the way people have given to me. If I can make a difference for even one person, then it'll be worth it." Samantha nodded, her expression proud. "You will, Tom. I know you will. And you're not alone. You have a whole community behind you now. People believe in you." Tom's heart swelled at her words. He had spent so long feeling invisible, unwanted. Now he felt like he was finally part of something bigger. "Thanks, Sam," he said again, "for everything." Samantha stayed for a while, helping Tom put away the groceries and talking about the new community outreach program he would be working with. They had already set up a few events at the community center, including food drives and housing assistance workshops. Tom would be working directly with people who needed help, guiding them to the resources available and offering support. After Samantha left, Tom sat at the small table looking out the window at the fading light. The sky was awash of oranges and pinks, the sun dipping below the horizon. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the night spent sleeping in the park, the day he had found David. It all seemed like pieces of a puzzle that had finally come together. Tom's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing. He picked it up and saw an unfamiliar number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Hello, Tom? It's Robert Caldwell." Tom's heart skipped a beat. "Mayor Caldwell," he said, standing up instinctively. "What can I do for you?" The mayor's voice was warm, friendly. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're settling into the new place. David's been asking about you nonstop. He was thrilled to hear you've got your own apartment now." Tom smiled. "I'm settling in just fine. The apartment's great, and tell David I said hello. He's a good kid." "I will," the mayor said. "And listen, Tom, I wanted to thank you again. What you did for David, it changed my perspective. It made me realize that we can do more, not just for those in positions of power, but for everyone in this city. I want to work with you to make sure that our community is a place where everyone has a chance to succeed." Tom felt a surge of gratitude. "I'd be honored to work with you, Mayor Caldwell. I've always wanted to help others, to give back in some way. If I can do that, then everything I've been through will have been worth it." "We'll make it happen," the mayor promised. "I'm setting up a meeting with the city council next week to discuss expanding our outreach programs. I'd like you to be there to share your story and help us build something that works for everyone." Tom felt a mix of nerves and excitement. "I'll be there," he said firmly. "Thank you, Mayor Caldwell, for giving me this opportunity." "Thank you, Tom," the mayor replied. "You've shown me what it means to truly serve the people. I look forward to working together." They ended the call, and Tom stood by the window, staring out at the city, his city. A place that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming now felt like home. He thought about the meeting with the city council, the chance to share his story and help shape a better future for others. It was more than he had ever hoped for. As the last light of day faded into night, Tom moved to the bed and lay down, closing his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The darkness was no longer something to fear. He had found his place in the world, a purpose that gave his life meaning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Tom knew he could face them. He had friends, a community, and a sense of belonging that couldn't be taken away. The world had given him a second chance, and he intended to make the most of it. Tom drifted off to sleep with a smile on his face, ready for whatever the future held. Tom sat at his new desk, looking over some of the flyers he'd been asked to distribute for the upcoming community outreach event. The small office was located in the community center, where he had found refuge just a few weeks ago. Now it was his workplace, a place where he could make a difference. His new job as a community liaison had kept him busy, but it was a good kind of busy. He had spent his days meeting people, listening to their stories, and guiding them to the resources they needed. It was the kind of work that filled him with purpose. There was a knock at the door. Tom looked up and saw David standing there, a grin on his face. "Tom, can I come in?" Tom's face lit up. "David? Of course, come on in." He stood and moved around the desk, greeting David with a pat on the shoulder. "What brings you here?" David held up a small paper bag. "I brought you lunch. My mom made sandwiches and cookies. She said it was the least we could do." Tom smiled warmly. "That's really nice of her. Tell your mom I said thank you." David nodded and handed Tom the bag, then looked around the small office. "Wow, this is where you work now?" "Yeah," Tom said, sitting back down and gesturing for David to take a seat. "It's not much, but it's a start. I get to help people who are going through tough times, like I did. It feels good to be able to give back." David sat down, looking thoughtful. "I told my dad that I want to help too. He said maybe I could come with you to one of the events to see what you do. Is that okay?" Tom's heart swelled with pride. "That's more than okay, David. I'd love for you to help out. We have a food drive next weekend. You can come and help us pack and hand out bags. People would love to see you there." David's face lit up. "Really? That would be awesome. I want to help people just like you do, Tom." Tom nodded. "You already do, David. You helped me when I needed it most. You're the reason I'm here today doing this work. Never forget that." David looked down at his hands, a shy smile on his face. "I'm glad I met you, Tom. You've taught me so much." Tom felt a lump in his throat. "And you've taught me a lot too, David. More than you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, eating the sandwiches David had brought. The room was quiet, the only sound the rustling of paper and the occasional clink of a glass. Tom watched David as he ate, thinking about how much the boy had grown in such a short time. There was a maturity in David's eyes that hadn't been there before, a kindness that shone through in everything he did. After they finished their lunch, David reached into his backpack and pulled out a small book. "I brought you this," he said, handing it to Tom. It's my favorite. I thought you might like it. Tom took the book, looking at the cover. It was a well-worn copy of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Tom smiled, feeling a pang of nostalgia. This was one of my favorites, too, when I was your age, he said. Thank you, David. I'll make sure to read it. David beamed. You're welcome. Maybe we can talk about it when you're done. Tom nodded. I'd like that. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about books, school, and life. David told Tom about his friends, about a science project he was working on, and about how his father was planning to expand the community outreach programs. Tom listened, offering advice and encouragement where he could, enjoying the boys' company. It was moments like these that made all the hardships he'd endured worth it. As the afternoon turned to evening, Tom glanced at the clock. I should probably get back to work, he said, though he didn't want the day to end. I have some flyers to finish before the event next week. David stood up, a reluctant look on his face. I guess I should go home too. My mom will be wondering where I am. Tom walked with David to the door, opening it for him. You take care, David. And remember, you are always welcome here. Anytime. David nodded. Thanks, Tom. I'll be back soon, I promise. Tom watched as David headed down the hallway, his backpack bouncing against his back. The boy turned around once, waving, before disappearing around the corner. Tom stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He had found a friend in David, and in many ways David had saved him just as much as he had saved the boy. Tom returned to his desk, looking at the book David had given him. He opened it to the first page, running his fingers over the words. He thought about the journey he had been on, the nights spent in the park, the fear and uncertainty that had once consumed him. Now he had a place to call home, a job that gave him purpose, and a community that believed in him. As he sat there, the door opened again, and Samantha poked her head in. Hey, Tom, how's it going? Tom looked up and smiled. Good, Sam, better than ever. Samantha stepped inside, looking around the room. David was here earlier, wasn't he? I saw him leaving. Tom nodded. Yeah, he brought me lunch. We talked for a while. He's a great kid, Samantha smiled. He really looks up to you, you know. You've made a big impact on his life. Tom shrugged modestly. I just did what I could. He's the one who made it all happen. Samantha sat down in the chair David had vacated. I'm proud of you, Tom. You've come a long way, and you're making a difference, just like you always wanted. Tom looked around the office, at the flyers on the desk, at the book in his hands. Yeah, he said softly. I guess I am. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them content. Tom felt the warmth of the room, the sense of belonging that filled his heart. He had found his place in the world, a place where he could do good, where he could make a difference. And he had found people who believed in him, who saw him for who he really was. Tom knew there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. He had a community behind him, and friends who cared, and a purpose that gave his life meaning. As he looked out the window at the city, at the people walking by, he felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. This was just the beginning, Tom realized. There was so much more to do, so many more people to help, and he was ready to face it all, one day at a time. With a smile, Tom closed the book and turned back to his desk, ready to get to work.